Good morning. Those of you with good memories may realise that I didn't own up to my error of last month. On the 23rd of June, in the way old duffers sometimes do, I turned over several pages of the lectionary by mistake and landed on the 14th of July. I can only explain my failure to notice until it was too late by saying that I was looking in the same position on the page, and if you've ever seen the lectionary, you'll know that all the pages look pretty much the same until you clean your glasses. So what to do? Pick another reading? Well, there are plenty to choose from. But I was a bit torn the last time about which bit of that reading to talk about, so I'm going to use the same reading again, Luke 19:41 to 48. But I'm going to say different things. After all, John had Psalm 98 twice in yesterday's morning prayer. So anyway, here it is. I've made Deirdre record it again.
As Jesus came near and saw the city, he wept over it, saying, "If you, even you, had only recognized on this day the things that make for peace, but now they are hidden from your eyes. Indeed, the days will come upon you when your enemies will set up ramparts around you and surround you and hem you in on every side. They will crush you to the ground, you and your children within you, and they will not leave within you one stone upon another, because you did not recognize the time of your visitation from God." Then he entered the temple and began to drive out those who were selling things there, and he said, "It is written, 'My house shall be a house of prayer,' but you have made it a den of robbers." Every day he was teaching in the temple. The chief priests, the scribes, the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they did not find anything they could do, for all the people were spellbound by what they heard.
I did refer to the traders in the temple last time, but I didn't connect what they were doing, which so enraged Jesus, with the regularly surfacing discussion, perhaps sometimes even argument, in our churches today, including our own church, about buying and selling in church. And I do realise that those of you watching and listening may have quite differing ideas about this issue. You can only have mine today, I'm afraid, but I'm very happy to discuss. I think it's quite wrong to compare what was happening in the temple as Jesus entered it with some of our modern practices today. The temple traders were there every day, except on the Sabbath, I imagine. Because of the very strict laws about sacrificing, people were often obliged to use the traders' stalls to obtain what they needed for sacrifice or offering. Those elements of the Jewish religion were an integral part of Jewish life. They weren't optional. You made sacrifices or offerings whenever a life event happened: a birth, a circumcision, a dedication, a betrothal, a wedding, harvest, a healing, a death. At the root of all this was thanksgiving and atonement. God was the giver of all good things and the judge of all. Offerings and sacrifices acknowledged his supremacy over all creation and all human activity. There's actually much to applaud in that. But men, and only men of course, had distorted things, perhaps innocently, perhaps not. As I said last time, offerings of money had to be made in temple coinage, quite different from the universal Roman stuff. To use that would have sullied the temple, and would have been an unacceptable offering, earning, they believed, God's displeasure. If you wanted to sacrifice a living creature, something that could only be done in the one and only temple, you might have needed to purchase a dove or two, or maybe even a lamb. I'm not really sure whether the traders sold those. I suppose if you had animals of your own, you could offer one of them, but if you were, for example, a potter or a carpenter, you would need to obtain an animal from a merchant. The money handed over would have included a sizable profit for the merchant, so you could reasonably say the temple was their place of business. The worship of God was not on their agenda. Well, let's turn to merchandising in our churches today. I can well understand why it disquiets many people. Jesus' furious outburst rings in our ears. I don't need to look it up. It's in my head. My house is called a house of prayer, but you have turned it into a den of thieves. That piece of invective is the yardstick by which I think we ought to assess what we do in church. Do we find dens of thieves in them? Well, I do have difficulty, though not insurmountable difficulty, when I go into one of our beautiful cathedrals and find a sizable shop selling postcards, CDs, cuddly bishop dolls, key rings and so forth. I know that the profits raised do not line anyone's pocket. They're intended to help keep the cathedral solvent. We don't have the same state support for these vast and ancient buildings as some other countries do, France and Germany, for example. They provide for their national architectural treasures. You will know from our recent letter, including the laying out of our own financial position, that the Church of England receives little or no governmental support. This is in a way rather strange, I think, since it is the state religion, whereas France and Germany, which have no state religion, support the churches as far as the buildings are concerned anyway. Nonetheless, there is something about the resemblance between church bookstalls and similar outlets in stately homes which makes me slightly queasy sometimes. I think I just need to ask myself if I would rather our cathedrals fell into ruin and became unsafe to use. I undoubtedly would not. So let's turn to the sort of marketing we do in St. Mark's. It's almost uniquely sold in aid of those producers and manufacturers who are living on the margins of economic survival, as often as not in the third world countries, where they are offered ludicrously small returns for their produce by the big commercial organisations, who will drive down prices of the goods on their shelves at the expense of those who have little or no voice or influence. When Tesco says every little helps, it doesn't help them. They're as likely to bear the brunt of price reductions as the large commercial conglomerates. And of course, I'm only using Tesco as a convenient example. Virtually all businesses which buy from the third world operate in much the same way. God judges us by what's in our hearts, not by a brief and stark episode in Jesus' ministry. If we buy peanut butter or coffee or a t-shirt produced by peasant farmers and artisan weavers in poor countries because we want them to have a fair share of the profit, rather than buying a similar product more cheaply in town, I think we're doing a godly thing. No one would ever suggest buying and selling during a service, whereas of course the temple traders were plying their trade all day, 6 days a week. We worship, and then, if we choose, we buy in the knowledge that we're helping those for whom every penny counts, and who will get every penny that does not go into the unavoidable costs of distributing their goods. In the end, each of us has to judge what is acceptable to God, and that is really the only criterion that matters. But I would earnestly argue that we should not let an uninterpreted Bible story govern our actions. You have to know the context of Jesus' temple outburst and know that our actions in church are simply not comparable to what was happening there. The presence of items for sale in church is no more offensive to God, I would suggest, than a fish and chip supper in church during a quiz, the proceeds of which, let's remember, go directly into maintaining our own family place of worship. I'm more than comfortable with both. Anyway, you can have a chat about it over lunch, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it together at some time in the near future. Until next time, God bless you and goodbye.